Sarah Mitchell stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed only 110 pounds soaking wet. At 22 years old, she had joined the Army National Guard with dreams of serving her country. But those dreams seemed to crumble during her first week of basic training. The drill sergeant's voice boomed across the training ground as Sarah struggled to complete her push-ups. "Mitchell, you call those push-ups? My grandmother could do better and she's been dead for 10 years. The other recruit snickered as Sarah's arms shook with effort, her face red with embarrassment and exhaustion. Sarah had always been the smallest kid in her class back in rural Ohio. Growing up on a farm, she learned to work hard, but physical strength had never been her strong suit. Her older brothers often joked that she couldn't lift a hay bale if her life depended on it. When she announced her decision to join the military, her family's reaction was mixed. Her mother worried constantly while her father simply shook his head in doubt. "You sure about this, kiddo?" her father had asked, watching her struggle to load feed bags into the truck. "The military ain't no place for someone your size. You might get yourself or someone else hurt." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind as she faced one challenge after another during training. The obstacle course seemed designed for people twice her size. The weighted marches left her lagging behind the group, gasping for air while others seemed to glide effortlessly forward. During combat training exercises, she was often the first one killed in simulations, unable to keep up with the faster, stronger recruits. Her bunkmate, Jessica, tried to offer encouragement. "Don't let them get to you, Sarah. You've got heart, and that counts for something." But even Jessica's kind words couldn't drown out the constant criticism and doubt from instructors who seemed convinced that Sarah would never make it as a real soldier. The worst moment came. During weapons training, Sarah struggled to handle the heavy rifle properly, and during a live fire exercise, she missed most of her targets. The range instructor pulled her aside afterward, his expression serious and disappointing. "Listen, Mitchell," he said, not unkindly but with brutal honesty. "I've been doing this for 15 years and I can usually tell who's got what it takes. You're a good kid, got a good attitude, but this job requires physical capabilities you just don't have. Maybe you should consider a different career path. There's no shame in knowing your limitations." That night, Sarah sat on her bunk staring at the phone in her hands. She had already dialed half of her mother's number 3 times, ready to call and ask to come home. The other recruits were asleep around her, their steady breathing a reminder of how easily this life seemed to come to them. She thought about quitting. It would be so simple to pack her bags and return to the farm, to a life where her size didn't matter, where she wasn't constantly reminded of her physical limitations. Her family would welcome her back with open arms, probably relieved that she had finally accepted what they all seemed to know from the beginning. But something deep inside Sarah refused to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness inherited from her farming family, or maybe it was the memory of her grandfather, who had served in Vietnam despite being told he was too old for combat. He had always taught her that strength came in many forms, and that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Instead of calling her mother, Sarah put the phone away and pulled out a notebook. She began writing down every criticism, every failure, every moment of doubt she had experienced. Then, next to each negative comment, she wrote what she would do to improve. If she couldn't do enough push-ups, she would do them every spare moment she had. If she was too slow on the obstacle course, she would practice the individual elements until they became second nature. The next morning, while the other recruits slept, Sarah was outside doing push-ups in the pre-dawn darkness. When others went to the mess hall for extra portions, she was running laps around the base. She studied tactics and strategy with the same intensity she had once applied to her farm chores, memorizing every detail until it became instinctive. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Her push-up count increased from 5 to 10, then to 20. Her running times improved by seconds, then minutes. She still wasn't the strongest or fastest recruit, but she was no longer the automatic failure everyone expected her to be. The instructors began to notice her improvement, though their skepticism remained. "Not bad, Mitchell," the range instructor admitted after she hit 7 out of 10 targets. Still not great, but not bad. For Sarah, those grudging words of partial approval felt like a victory parade. As basic training neared its end, Sarah had proven she could meet the minimum standards, but she knew that meeting minimums wouldn't change anyone's mind about her capabilities. She would need to prove herself in real situations, under real pressure, where lives might depend on her actions. The final training exercise was a simulated combat scenario, where the recruits had to work as a team to complete various objectives while under mock enemy fire. Sarah was assigned to a support role, expected to stay back and provide communications rather than engage in direct action. As her unit moved through the training area, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being protected, still being treated as the weak link who needed to be kept out of harm's way. 2 years after barely graduating from basic training, Sarah found herself deployed to Afghanistan with the 127th Infantry Regiment. The mountains of Kandahar province were a world away from the rolling hills of Ohio, and the reality of combat was nothing like the training exercises she had struggled through. Despite her improvements during training, Sarah was still assigned to what many considered the safe jobs. While other soldiers went on dangerous patrol missions, she worked in communications, coordinating supply drops and maintaining radio contact with forward operating bases. Her fellow soldiers treated her with friendly respect, but she could sense their protective attitude. They saw her as someone who needed to be kept away from real danger. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 tours, had become something of a mentor to Sarah. "You've come a long way from that scared kid who could barely hold a rifle," he told her one evening as they sat in the mess tent. "But out here, it's different than training. Combat doesn't care how many push-ups you can do. It's about split-second decisions and keeping your head when everything goes to hell." Sarah appreciated Mike's guidance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being treated like damaged goods. When other soldiers shared stories of firefights and close calls, she had nothing to contribute. Her war consisted of radio chatter and supply manifests. Important work, but hardly the kind of service she had imagined when she first enlisted. The May forward operating base where Sarah was stationed sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills that provided perfect cover for enemy fighters. Taliban forces regularly launched attacks on coalition forces, and the sound of incoming mortars had become as common as the call to chow. Sarah had grown used to the routine of diving for cover and waiting for the all-clear, but she had never been directly involved in combat. That changed on a sweltering August morning when intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity in the surrounding hills. Captain Williams called a briefing for all available personnel, his expression grim as he outlined the situation. "We've got reliable intel that Taliban forces are planning a major assault on supply route Tampa," he explained, pointing to a map of the local area. "This road is critical for getting supplies to our forward positions. If they shut it down, we've got soldiers who will be cut off and vulnerable." The captain's finger traced along the winding mountain road that connected several smaller outposts to the main base. "We're sending out a convoy to reinforce the checkpoints along Tampa. It's going to be dangerous and we expect heavy resistance." Sarah listened intently as the captain assigned roles for the mission. The usual suspects got the combat positions. Experienced soldiers like Rodriguez and Thompson who had proven themselves under fire. Sarah assumed she would remain behind to coordinate communications as always. "Mitchell," the captain said, surprising her. "You're going out with Alpha Team as their radio operator. Rodriguez requested you specifically." The room fell silent for a moment. Sarah felt every eye turned toward her, some expressing concern, others curiosity about how she would handle her first real combat mission. Mike Rodriguez nodded at her encouragingly, but she could see the worry in his eyes too. After the briefing, Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside. "Listen, I know this is your first time outside the wire for real combat, but I need someone I can trust on communications. You know the protocols better than anyone, and if things go bad, clear communication could save lives." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, the chance to prove that she belonged among these soldiers. But she also understood the weight of responsibility. People's lives would depend on her ability to perform under pressure. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles carrying 24 soldiers total. Sarah rode in the second vehicle with Rodriguez's squad, her radio equipment carefully secured beside her. As they rolled out of the base gates, she felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it over the engine noise. The first checkpoint was located about 10 miles up the mountain road, at a position that overlooked a narrow valley. The ride there was tense but uneventful, with soldiers scanning the surrounding hills for any signs of enemy movement. Sarah maintained regular contact with base, reporting their progress and receiving updates on enemy positions. When they reached the checkpoint, The situation became clear immediately. The small outpost, which normally housed 6 soldiers, was under heavy fire from Taliban fighters positioned in the rocks above. Smoke was rising from one of the buildings, and the soldiers inside were pinned down, unable to move without exposing themselves to sniper fire. Alpha Team, we've got friendlies taking heavy fire. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. We need to move up and provide suppression so they can evacuate their wounded. As the convoy vehicles took defensive positions, Sarah set up her radio equipment behind the cover of their armored truck. Through her headset, she could hear the desperate voices of the trapped soldiers calling for medical evacuation and ammunition resupply. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she realized that this was exactly the kind of scenario where clear communication would mean the difference between life and death. The Taliban fighters had chosen their position well. They controlled the high ground and had clear fields of fire down into the valley where the checkpoint was located. Any attempt to reach the trapped soldiers would require crossing open ground while under enemy observation. Base, this is Alpha Team, Sarah transmitted, her training taking over despite her fear. We have troops in contact at Checkpoint Delta, requesting immediate air support and medical evacuation. Enemy fighters are in elevated positions. Grid coordinates follow. As she relayed the precise location information that would guide rescue helicopters and attack aircraft to the scene, Sarah realized that her role was far from safe or passive. She was the lifeline connecting the soldiers in the field with the resources they needed to survive. Every word she spoke could determine whether her fellow soldiers made it home alive. The battle for Checkpoint Delta erupted with sudden, devastating intensity. Taliban fighters emerged from concealed positions throughout the rocky hills, their automatic weapons creating a deadly crossfire that trapped both the original checkpoint garrison and the rescue convoy in a nightmare of bullets and explosions. Sarah pressed herself against the armored vehicle, her radio crackling with urgent transmissions from multiple sources. Alpha Team taking heavy fire from the North Ridge. Checkpoint Delta has 2 wounded, need immediate medical evacuation. Base, we need air support now. The voices overlapped in a chaotic symphony of desperation and determination. Rodriguez appeared beside her, his face grim as he surveyed the tactical situation. Sarah, I need you to coordinate with base and get us some close air support. The enemy has us pinned down and we can't reach the checkpoint without taking massive casualties. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the trapped soldiers at the checkpoint. They were hunkered down behind concrete barriers, returning fire when possible, but clearly running low on ammunition. Smoke continued to rise from their damaged radio equipment, which meant Sarah's radio was their only link to rescue. This is Mitchell with Alpha Team, she transmitted, forcing her voice to remain calm and clear despite the bullets whining overhead. We have 12 friendlies trapped at Checkpoint Delta, estimated 30 to 40 enemy fighters in elevated positions. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation. The response came back filled with static and bad news. Alpha Team, this is base. Weather conditions have grounded air support for the next 30 minutes minimum. Medical evacuation is standing by but cannot land under current fire conditions. You'll need to secure a landing zone. Sarah's heart sank. 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours for the soldiers who were bleeding and running out of ammunition at the checkpoint. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions that seemed to surround the entire valley. And the intensity of incoming fire was increasing rather than decreasing. Rodriguez gathered his squad leaders for a quick tactical conference behind the vehicle. We've got to get up there and extract those guys ourselves, he said, pointing toward the checkpoint. If we wait for air support, they'll either bleed out or run out of ammo. The plan was desperate but simple. Half the squad would provide covering fire from their current position, while Rodriguez led an assault team up the hill to the checkpoint. They would evacuate the wounded soldiers and try to hold the position until air support arrived. Mitchell, you stay here and keep coordinating with base, Rodriguez ordered. Keep trying to get us that air support and guide the medical evacuation in as soon as we secure a landing zone. Sarah nodded. But as Rodriguez's team prepared to move out, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the plan. The distance to the checkpoint was nearly 200 meters of open ground, and enemy fire was coming from multiple directions. Even with covering fire, Rodriguez's small team would be exposed and vulnerable during the approach. As the assault team began their advance, Sarah watched through her binoculars while maintaining radio contact with base. The covering fire from their position helped suppress some enemy positions, but Taliban fighters quickly repositioned and began focusing their fire on Rodriguez's advancing soldiers. Halfway to the checkpoint, disaster struck. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded near Rodriguez's team, and Sarah watched in horror as 3 soldiers went down. Rodriguez himself was hit in the leg but continued moving, dragging one wounded soldier toward cover while another team member helped the 3rd casualty. "Base, we have multiple wounded in the open," Sarah transmitted urgently. "Alpha team leader and 2 others are down. They're pinned in the open ground between our position and the checkpoint." The situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. Instead of rescuing the trapped soldiers at the checkpoint, Rodriguez's team now needed rescuing themselves. They were caught in a deadly zone with nowhere to go, taking fire from multiple directions while trying to treat their wounded. Sarah could see Rodriguez through her binoculars, blood streaming down his leg as he applied pressure to another soldier's chest wound. The 3rd wounded soldier, Private Johnson, was unconscious and bleeding heavily from a head injury. They had managed to find cover behind a few large rocks, but their position was precarious and enemy fighters were moving to flank them. The remaining members of Alpha Team at the vehicles were providing covering fire, but they couldn't advance without leaving their defensive position unprotected. The soldiers at the original checkpoint were still trapped and running low on ammunition. Medical evacuation helicopters were still grounded due to weather conditions, and air support remained 30 minutes away. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that the entire mission was falling apart. In a few minutes, enemy fighters would overwhelm Rodriguez's isolated team. The checkpoint garrison would run out of ammunition and be overrun. More soldiers would die because they couldn't reach them in time. She had spent 2 years being protected, being kept away from real danger because everyone believed she was too weak, too small, too limited to make a real difference in combat. But as she watched her fellow soldiers dying in that rocky valley, Sarah understood that sometimes the most important moments in life don't care about your limitations. "Base, this is Mitchell," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Alpha team leader is wounded and pinned down with casualties. I'm going to attempt a rescue." The squad leader who had remained with the vehicles immediately protested. "Mitchell, negative. You stay on that radio and coordinate support. We'll find another way to get Rodriguez out of there." But Sarah was already moving, slinging her rifle and grabbing the medical kit from their vehicle. She had studied the terrain carefully while coordinating the mission, and she had noticed something the others might have missed. There was a small gully that ran along the eastern side of the valley, mostly hidden from enemy observation points. If she could reach it, she might be able to get close to Rodriguez's position without being detected. As she prepared to leave the relative safety of the armored vehicles, Sarah thought about all the people who had doubted her capabilities. Her father, who worried she would get herself or others hurt. The drill instructors who believed she didn't have what it takes. Even Rodriguez, who had requested her for this mission, but still expected her to stay safely behind while others took the real risks. None of that mattered now. 3 soldiers were bleeding in the open, and she was the only one in position to help them. Sarah moved through the rocky gully like a ghost, her small frame allowing her to navigate spaces that would have been impossible for larger soldiers. The natural depression in the landscape provided cover from most enemy positions, but she could still hear bullets cracking overhead and the occasional ricochet off nearby rocks. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to the relative safety of the armored vehicles where she belonged. But the image of Rodriguez bleeding in the open, trying desperately to keep his wounded soldiers alive, drove her forward. She had trained for this moment without knowing it. All those extra hours of practice, all those nights studying tactics and medical procedures. The gully curved toward the area where Rodriguez's team had taken cover, but the final 50 meters would require crossing open ground under enemy observation. Sarah paused at the edge of cover, studying the terrain and timing the enemy fire patterns. She noticed that the Taliban fighters were focusing most of their attention on the vehicles below and the checkpoint above, creating brief gaps in their coverage of the middle ground. Through her radio earpiece, she could hear the desperate situation developing. "Alpha Base, this is Checkpoint Delta. We're down to our last magazines." "Base, Rodriguez is hit bad. We need immediate medical evacuation." The voices were becoming more strained, more desperate with each transmission. Sarah waited for a lull in the incoming fire, then sprinted across the open ground in a low crouch. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet, but her small size and erratic movement made her a difficult target. She dove behind the rocks where Rodriguez had taken shelter, her heart pounding as she assessed the situation. Rodriguez was pale and sweating, a makeshift tourniquet around his upper leg where shrapnel had torn through muscle and possibly nicked an artery. Private Johnson was unconscious, blood seeping from a head wound that needed immediate attention. Specialist Martinez was conscious but had taken a round through his shoulder, rendering his right arm useless. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing here?" Rodriguez gasped, his voice tight with pain and shock. "You're supposed to be coordinating communications." "The communications are working fine," Sarah replied, already opening the medical kit and beginning to assess the wounds. "But you're bleeding to death and someone needs to get you out of here." She worked quickly, applying fresh dressings to Johnson's head wound and checking his pulse. He was alive but needed immediate medical attention that she couldn't provide in their current position. Martinez's shoulder wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening, though he was losing blood steadily. Rodriguez's leg was the most critical injury. The tourniquet had slowed the bleeding, but the wound needed surgical attention soon or he could lose the leg entirely. More immediately, all 3 wounded soldiers were trapped in a position that enemy fighters were working to surround. "Listen, Sarah," Rodriguez said, gripping her arm with surprising strength. "You did good getting here, but you can't carry all 3 of us out. Take Martinez, he can still walk with help. Get him back to the vehicles and send up a real rescue team." Sarah looked at the wounded soldiers, then at the terrain between their position and safety. Rodriguez was right that she couldn't carry all 3 men at once, but she also knew that any delay could be fatal. Enemy fighters were moving to flank their position, and the covering fire from the vehicles below was becoming less effective as Taliban forces repositioned. "No," she said firmly, surprising both Rodriguez and Martinez. "I'm not leaving anyone behind." She keyed her radio and transmitted to the vehicles below. "Alpha Base, this is Mitchell. I'm with the wounded soldiers and I need you to concentrate all your fire on the northern ridge in exactly 2 minutes. I'm going to move the casualties one at a time." The response was immediate and adamant. "Negative, Mitchell. Stay in position until we can organize a proper rescue." Sarah ignored the order and began preparing Johnson for movement. The unconscious soldier was dead weight, but her small size actually worked to her advantage in the rocky terrain. She could navigate spaces and routes that larger soldiers couldn't use, and her low profile made her a harder target for enemy snipers. "Sarah, this is insane," Martinez protested. "You can't carry him that distance under fire. You'll get yourself killed and him too." "Maybe," Sarah admitted, securing Johnson's equipment and preparing to lift him. "But if I don't try, you're all dead anyway." She had studied the route carefully during her approach, identifying cover positions and planning multiple paths back to safety. The key was timing and using the terrain to her advantage. Where larger soldiers would be forced to expose themselves, she could move through low spots and narrow gaps between rocks. The covering fire began precisely on schedule, with the soldiers at the vehicles directing intense fire at known enemy positions. Sarah lifted Johnson in a fireman's carry, surprised at how manageable his weight felt with adrenaline coursing through her system. She had always been strong for her size, and farm work had taught her how to carry heavy loads efficiently. The first part of the route took her through relatively good cover, but twice she had to cross open areas where enemy fire immediately intensified. Bullets cracked overhead and sparked off rocks inches from her position. But she kept moving, using short rushes between cover points and constantly varying her route to avoid predictable patterns. Johnson regained consciousness halfway back to the vehicles, his confused mumbling nearly giving away their position to nearby enemy fighters. Sarah whispered urgently for him to stay quiet and keep still, while simultaneously calling in adjustments to the covering fire to suppress a machine gun position that had spotted them. When she finally reached the vehicles with Johnson, the other soldiers stared at her in amazement. "How the hell did you do that?" one of them asked as medics began treating Johnson's wounds. 2 more to go," Sarah gasped, already preparing for the return trip. Her legs felt like rubber, and her lungs burned from the thin mountain air. But Rodriguez and Martinez were still trapped and bleeding in those rocks. The squad leader grabbed her arm as she prepared to leave again. "Mitchell, you can't keep doing this. We'll lose you too, and then we'll have 4 casualties instead of 3. Sarah looked back toward the rocky outcrop where she could see muzzle flashes from Rodriguez's position as he continued returning fire despite his wounds. "Those are our soldiers up there," she said simply. "We don't leave our people behind." Before anyone could stop her, she was moving again, racing back across the deadly ground toward her wounded teammates. The second rescue attempt proved even more dangerous than the first. Taliban fighters had observed Sarah's initial route and repositioned to cover the areas she had used for concealment. As she moved back toward Rodriguez and Martinez, enemy fire seemed to follow her every step, forcing her to take longer detours and use less favorable terrain. Martinez was ready when she reached their position, his good arm prepared to help with his own evacuation. Rodriguez had grown weaker, his face pale from blood loss despite the tourniquet, but his eyes still held the determined focus of a combat veteran. "Take Martinez first," Rodriguez ordered weakly. "He can help move himself and I can still provide covering fire from here." Sarah shook her head, already assessing Rodriguez's condition. The tourniquet had been in place too long and she could see signs of shock setting in. If he wasn't evacuated soon, he would either bleed to death or lose his leg entirely. "You're in worse shape," she told Rodriguez. "Martinez can wait another few minutes, but you can't. That's an order." "Soldier?" Rodriguez tried to assert his authority, but his voice lacked its usual strength. "Then court-martial me later," Sarah replied, already positioning herself to lift Rodriguez. "Right now I'm saving your life." Rodriguez was heavier than Johnson and barely conscious, making the evacuation far more difficult. Sarah struggled under his weight as bullets whined overhead, forcing her to move more slowly and take more risks with exposure to enemy fire. The covering fire from the vehicles below helped, but Taliban fighters were becoming more accurate as they adjusted to her tactics. Halfway back to safety, Rodriguez regained enough consciousness to realize what was happening. "Sarah, put me down," he mumbled. "You can't carry me this far. Save yourself and Martinez." "Not happening," Sarah gasped, shifting his weight to navigate around a large boulder. "We're almost there. Just stay quiet and let me do this." A burst of automatic fire from a nearby enemy position forced her to dive for cover, with Rodriguez's additional weight nearly causing her to lose her balance on the rocky slope. For a terrifying moment, she thought they were both going to tumble down the mountainside, completely exposed to enemy fire. She managed to regain her footing and continue moving, but the delay had allowed enemy fighters to reposition again. The final approach to the vehicles would require crossing the most dangerous stretch of open ground, with limited cover and multiple enemy positions providing overlapping fields of fire. "Alpha Base, I need maximum suppression on all northern positions," she radioed, breathing heavily from the exertion of carrying Rodriguez. "I'm coming in with the team leader, and I'm going to be completely exposed for the next 30 seconds. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every soldier at the vehicle position opened fire simultaneously, creating such a volume of bullets that enemy fighters were forced to take cover rather than return fire. Sarah used the suppression to make her final sprint, Rodriguez's weight feeling impossible as her exhausted muscles screamed in protest. She collapsed behind the vehicles as medics rushed to treat Rodriguez's wounds, her entire body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. But even as the medical team worked to stabilize Rodriguez, Sarah was already preparing for her third trip back into the kill zone. "Mitchell, that's enough," the squad leader said firmly. "You've done more than anyone could ask. We'll get Martinez out another way." Sarah looked back toward the rocks where Martinez waited alone, now completely surrounded by enemy fighters who were moving to assault his position. The covering fire had been so intense during her last evacuation that most of the soldiers were reloading, creating a brief lull the Taliban forces were already exploiting. "There is no other way," she said, checking her rifle and gathering the last medical supplies. "If I don't get him now, they'll overrun his position in the next few minutes." She could see through her binoculars that Martinez was down to his last magazine, firing single shots to conserve ammunition. Enemy fighters were closing in from multiple directions, using the terrain to avoid the suppressive fire from the vehicles. In minutes, they would be close enough to overwhelm his position with grenades and close-range fire. The third trip across the kill zone was a nightmare of near misses and desperate improvisation. Enemy fighters had learned to predict her movements, forcing her to use routes that provided less cover but were less anticipated. Bullets struck rocks inches from her head, and twice she had to throw herself flat as grenades exploded nearby. When she reached Martinez, he was down to his last few rounds and had taken another bullet in his good arm. He was barely conscious from blood loss and shock, his ability to help with his own evacuation severely compromised. "About time," he whispered weakly as Sarah began assessing his new wounds. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." "Never," Sarah replied, applying pressure bandages to his fresh wounds. "We're getting out of here together." Martinez was lighter than Rodriguez but more severely wounded, requiring careful handling to avoid aggravating his injuries. As Sarah prepared to lift him, she realized that enemy fighters had used her previous evacuations to completely surround their position. There was no longer a safe route back to the vehicles. "Sarah," Martinez gasped, "they've got us surrounded. You can't carry me through that. Leave me here and get yourself out." Sarah studied the enemy positions, looking for any gap or weakness she could exploit. The Taliban fighters had been smart, using her own rescue attempts to position themselves for a final assault. But they had also made a mistake by focusing so intently on her previous routes that they had left one approach relatively unguarded. "Hold on tight," she told Martinez, lifting him carefully. "We're going out the back door." Instead of heading directly toward the vehicles, Sarah began moving up the slope toward the original checkpoint. It was the last direction enemy fighters would expect, and the route would take them through terrain too difficult for coordinated pursuit. The climb would be brutal while carrying a wounded soldier, but it might be their only chance. As they moved higher up the mountain, Sarah could hear enemy fighters below beginning their final assault on the position they had just abandoned. If her timing had been just a few minutes later, both she and Martinez would have been trapped with no possibility of escape. The checkpoint above them was still under siege, but the soldiers there had observed her rescue attempts and were prepared to provide covering fire for the final approach. As Sarah struggled up the last few meters of rocky slope with Martinez, bullets from the checkpoint garrison began suppressing enemy positions that were trying to follow them. She collapsed inside the checkpoint perimeter, Martinez barely conscious in her arms, as the defenders quickly moved to secure their position and treat his wounds. In less than an hour, she had carried 3 wounded soldiers out of a kill zone that experienced combat veterans had considered impossible to traverse under fire. The first helicopter arrived 30 minutes after Sarah reached the checkpoint with Martinez, its rotors beating against the thin mountain air as Taliban fighters continued their assault on the valley below. The medical evacuation crew worked quickly to load the wounded soldiers, their practiced efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of the ongoing battle. Rodriguez was conscious again as they loaded him onto the helicopter, his eyes finding Sarah through the crowd of medics and soldiers. "You saved my life," he said, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "All our lives. I've never seen anything like what you did out there." Johnson and Martinez were both stable, their wounds serious but not life-threatening thanks to the quick medical attention Sarah had provided during the evacuations. As the helicopter lifted off toward the main medical facility, Sarah watched, her wounded teammates disappear into the sky, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion that left her barely able to stand. The battle for the checkpoint continued for another 2 hours before air support finally arrived to drive off the Taliban fighters. Attack helicopters and close air support aircraft swept through the valley, eliminating enemy positions and allowing the remaining soldiers to secure the area. But the real victory had been achieved much earlier, when Sarah's actions had prevented the loss of 3 soldiers who would have certainly died without immediate evacuation. Word of Sarah's rescue mission spread through the military community with remarkable speed. The official after-action report documented how a 110-pound communications specialist had single-handedly evacuated 3 wounded soldiers from a surrounded position under heavy enemy fire, carrying each man individually across terrain that larger soldiers couldn't have navigated. Colonel Peterson, the regimental commander, arrived at the checkpoint the next day to personally debrief Sarah about the mission. His expression was serious as he reviewed the tactical situation and the decisions she had made during the rescue. "Specialist Mitchell," he said formally, "what you did yesterday was either the bravest act I've witnessed in 30 years of military service or the most reckless. Help me understand why you thought you could succeed when more experienced soldiers believed the rescue was impossible." Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Sir, I think everyone was looking at the situation from the perspective of what they couldn't do. The terrain was too difficult, the enemy fire too intense, the distances too far. but I was looking at what I could do differently. She explained how her size had allowed her to use routes that larger soldiers couldn't access, how her farm background had taught her to carry heavy loads efficiently, and how her intensive study of tactics and terrain had helped her identify weaknesses in enemy positions. Most importantly, sir, she continued, I wasn't thinking about whether I was strong enough or experienced enough. I was just thinking about getting our soldiers home alive. The colonel's expression softened slightly. Your actions saved 3 lives and demonstrated exceptional courage under fire. However, you also disobeyed direct orders and put yourself in extreme danger. In a different situation, that could have resulted in additional casualties rather than preventing them. Sarah accepted the criticism without argument. She understood that military discipline required following orders, even when individual judgment suggested a different course of action. But she also knew that she would make the same decision again if faced with similar circumstances.